And so, Maurice, for me, one of the things I think that's being lost right now is the ability of men to just talk as men to men. And that's why I think people who are now speaking to Black men or talking to women about men are the ones resonating. We have to, honestly, as a Black community, realize that there are a lot of forces trying to prevent us from being unified in any way. And these are people who are Black, who are usually young, who are usually not connected to the movement. And I mean the movement in the 80s, which includes the hip hop movement, which was a legitimate movement of 2 decades. They're not connected to the civil rights or Black Power movement before that. They're not connected to the civil rights movement before that. They're not connected to the Black labor movement before that. They're not connected to the Black cultural arts and Renaissance movement in the 1920s before that. 50 years of Black movements on multiple fronts. And these young people emerge with this sort of irresponsibility that they have no responsibility to Black history. They have no responsibility to Ella Baker. They have no responsibility to Callie House, who was the first person to be the Black leader of Reparations, a woman who they threw in jail and used the federal government's postal service to arrest her and put her in jail. Callie House, Callie, Callie House in Tennessee, led 300,000 people. Martin Luther King led 5,000. In his best day, King had 5,000 real followers. Callie House had 300,000. She was the Black movement. There was a Black civil rights movement before integration, before nationalism, and it was led by a woman named Callie House. My Skin is Black is True is a book by Mary Frances Berry on Callie House, where Callie House was the original leader of Black people after, Booker, after Frederick Douglass, and right contemporary with Booker Washington, and even after Booker Washington. She was the first person to lead a collective Black movement in America beyond abolition. So there was abolition, but the second mass movement of Black people was for reparations. And we as Black people have, because of the ignorance of our history and our desire to be, have likes and platforms, disconnect from that knowledge so that we don't understand a woman named Callie House was a legitimate leader for a long period of time, that the US federal government came down on her and threw her in prison using the postal service. And that's exactly what they did to Marcus Garvey a few years later. They cut their teeth on Callie House in order to get rid of Garvey, right? Callie House and her movement of Black, and there was a brother named Isaiah, I can't remember his last name right now, but a brother named Isaiah, they also threw in the prison. He was actually the leader and she was his assistant until they threw him in prison. And so this is in the 1890s. Callie House had been a slave for about 3 years. She and this organization of Blacks decided that they would sue the United States Treasury. And they would do it based on 4 years of unpaid labor as slaves, and that they named the amount of money to $63 to $68 million for 4 years of Black labor uncompensated by people who were slaves. The Black slaves did sue for reparations. So all these white folk for every generation since have been playing games with us, telling us I wasn't responsible for enslaving your people. I didn't own slaves and you weren't a slave. Well, and then they try to separate us from that history. But the reality,
is the point, James. It was Reverend Isaiah Dickinson, you were mentioning.
Thank you, Reverend Isaiah Dickinson, and he was the leader of it. And they threw him in prison. So Callie House steps up. She becomes the leader of this organization of 300,000 Black people. Now, that's a lot now, but you have to think about this as 1900s. She is intentionally forgotten. Why didn't you know about Tulsa, Oklahoma? Because they don't want you to know about the brutality of this people we're living in amongst, the evil that we live amongst, the always threatening massacres that we live amongst as Black people. They don't want you to know about Callie House, because then you would know that black people's original political science or policy preference was not integration. They wanted 40 acres and a mule. That was the original black politics in America, and nobody else anywhere in America is going to tell you that except right here on Black Men Screaming. It was not for integration. That comes in 1909 with the NACP, right? It was not for separation. We can go back to Martin Delany, and my book is on Black nationalism. You know I know that history. Black people who weren't trying to go back to Africa or integrate into the white world said, we don't want to go to Africa. We don't want no white integration. Give us 40 acres and a mule. We'll develop ourselves separately right here in America. And that was the original black politics. And then the white NAACP, the white NAACP, the white NAACP with two black faces. Du Bois, who they gave no power and told them just to write the magazine, The Crisis, and Ida B. Wells, who was there for a minute and then nothing else connected to it. A bunch of white liberals, Mary White Overton and others, came together and they created this. Why? Because black people up to this point were focused on compensation for the injury of slavery. So I'm trying to say this to convince us or to show us that black people, when you're talking about, young people today and social media and the proliferation of confusion of information, a lot of it has to do with the fact that people aren't anchored in knowledge of their own history.
Yes.
You don't know Callie House and you running around here talking shit about reparations. You should shut up, and you should not talk about reparations until you read up on Callie House and educate yourself to understand that it was never a black radical agenda, although the state immediately saw black people making an innocent demand for the compensation for the tort and injury against their black bodies. The government saw it as radical, but it was not a radical black power program.
Just so people know, James, it was a class action lawsuit. It was titled Johnson versus McAdoo in the federal court for I think it was $68 million against the U.S. Treasury. Yes, sir. And you said cotton tax collected between 1862 to 1868. Just for the factual part. Go ahead, James.
Yeah. No, this is beautiful background. Thank you, because people need to understand this was serious, and it was seriously done, and it was well done. And it provided a blueprint and a record for you and me. And if we are too dumb because we are trying to get likes and be modern or postmodern, playing in it, you're like a child playing it with a gun, because this is serious. And Callie House gave us a example of what could be done, how it could be done, but also she did it herself. So you and I can say we did that. We ain't just coming up with this out of nowhere. We have a precedent of how black people most proximate to slavery approached reparations, and how the government from the very beginning retarded it and confused it and broke it up with police and tax and jail power. They never treated it legitimately.